They thought the day would be quiet. The British camp at Isandlwana sprawled across the dry grasslands of Zululand, rows of white tents glowing under the African sun, supply wagons creaking, soldiers moving with the bored confidence of men who believed victory was already theirs. They built no trenches, no barricades, no fallback positions. The empire didn't need walls. It believed it was the wall. And then the ground shifted beneath them. Morning patrols trickled back with strange reports, Zulu scouts watching from the hills, dust clouds drifting in the distance, too large to be herds of cattle. Colonel Pauline brushed the warnings aside. He had orders to hold the camp, nothing more. But the truth revealed itself when Lieutenant Raw rode farther into the valley with his mounted infantry. He saw shapes, hundreds, then thousands, lying flat in the tall grass, a whole Zulu army hidden like a sleeping giant. Raw fired a single warning shot. The valley erupted into motion, shields rose, spears flashed, tens of thousands of warriors surged to their feet and charged like a living storm. Raw turned and raced back toward camp, shouting one message over the pounding of hooves: "They're coming!" Isandlwana snapped awake. Bugles screamed through the tents. Soldiers ran half-dressed, dragging on belts and boots, tripping over tent ropes. Horses reared. Mules snapped their leads and bolted. Officers shouted useless orders. Across the plains, the Zulu horns of command echoed, deep rolling calls that vibrated against the ribs. Colonel Durnford arrived with fresh troops, sweat soaking into his uniform. He took one look at the advancing Zulu horns, the classic encircling formation, the buffalo, and knew the British camp was a trap. He urged Pauline to pull back, to tighten the lines, to form a defensive knot. Pauline refused. He had orders, and orders were chains. The first shots cracked at 12:15 p.m. British rifles opened fire in smooth volleys, cutting down the charging Zulu vanguard. Dust lifted with every impact. Bodies dropped, but the Zulu kept coming. They ran low, fast, shields angled, feet silent on the hard earth. When bullets tore through their ranks, they closed the gaps instantly, the formation flowing like black water across the plain. Behind the British line, ammunition runners sprinted up and down the firing positions, struggling beneath the hot sun. Officers shouted for more boxes, more men, more time. Smoke drifted across the camp, thick and bitter, stinging eyes. By early afternoon, Durnford's right flank began to collapse. His men, low on ammunition, held off a tidal surge of Zulu warriors charging uphill through rifle fire. They held until their rifles clicked empty. Then they fell back, mounting their horses and trying to sprint toward camp, only to find the Zulu right horn swinging behind them, cutting them off. The encirclement had begun. Pauline saw the trap closing. For the first time, fear crossed his face. Isandlwana wasn't a battle anymore. It was a burial. The British center held the longest. They fired disciplined volleys, 2 shots a minute, tearing into the Zulu chest. Smoke engulfed the line. The ground shook with the impact of charging feet. Then, through the haze, the Zulu center surged, not with shouting, not with chaos, but with a cold, silent determination. They hit the British center like a hammer. Spears thrust under rifles, shields smashed into red coats. The British line, stretched thin and forced to fight too far from their own ammunition supply, finally shattered. Soldiers fell back in pieces, some toward the rocky ridge, some toward the wagon park, some simply into the dust. A cluster of companies scrambled onto a rocky rise and formed a final square, bayonets out, rifles raised. They fought like men possessed, firing downhill into waves of charging Zulu. Volley after volley tore holes in the ranks, but still the warriors climbed. When they reached the square, the fight turned intimate and brutal. No formation, no order, just men grappling in the dust, swinging rifles like clubs, stabbing with bayonets, grabbing shields, fighting until breath or blood ran out. When the last rifle fell silent, when the last bayonet thrust slowed, when the final defender collapsed, the ridge fell quiet. The Zulu army, victorious, did not celebrate. They turned and marched on. They knew something the British did not. Rorke's drift lay undefended on the border. A small mission station, a vulnerable outpost, a perfect target. Survivors fled Isandlwana, riders, runners, wounded men staggering on foot. They crossed the river with terror pounding behind them. The Zulu did not chase far. They had new orders, new prey. The survivors carried a message heavier than any wound. The camp is gone. They're coming for Rorke's drift. Less than 150 British soldiers waited at that station, unaware the Empire had just suffered one of its worst defeats. But the Zulu knew they had momentum, and they moved like ghosts. Late afternoon brought the first signs, a low rumble across the plains, too steady for thunder, too wide for horses. Private Hitchcock paused near the supply huts. He listened. Not wind, not carts, footsteps, thousands of them, moving in unison. He ran into the compound, shouting that the Zulu were coming. Lieutenant John Chard stepped from the storehouse with a map. Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead followed, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He'd been resting moments before the warning. A rider arrived carrying a message. "Column destroyed. Enemy advancing." The two officers looked at each other in silence. Retreat meant being slaughtered in the open. Evacuation meant leaving the wounded to die. Fighting was the only choice left. They turned the mission station into a fortress. Men dragged meal sacks, biscuit boxes, furniture, anything with weight, into position. They built chest-high walls, created kill zones, sealed hospital windows, armed the sick, dragged water barrels into defensive angles. Chard laid out the defenses like a man sketching his own survival. Bromhead patrolled the lines, loading rifles, steadying hands, whispering to the frightened. Even the wounded asked for weapons. Then the sun dipped, and the hills filled with black shapes, hundreds, then thousands, standing in perfect silence. Zulu warriors, shields polished, spears angled, shadows stretching like spears across the ground. One private whispered what every man felt. "We're not making it out of this." But they held the line. As the sun touched the horizon, a war cry shattered the sky. "Usuthu!" And the hills exploded as thousands of warriors charged downhill toward the tiny mission station. Dust rose behind them like a storm. The defenders tightened their grips. The outnumbered braced for the unstoppable. And in that moment, with the shadows running long and the ground trembling beneath the charge, history tilted toward a battle where the few would stand against the many and refuse to fall. The first Zulu wave hit like a thrown hammer, fast, heavy, unavoidable. They came sprinting across the dry red earth, shields lifted, spears angled low, feet pounding in perfect rhythm. Dust rose behind them like a storm cloud, swallowing the sunset in a haze of gold and smoke. Inside the mission station, 150 British defenders clenched their rifles, breaths sharp and shallow. And then the firing began. The first volley cracked through the air, one unified blast that dropped a dozen Zulu warriors mid-stride. But the rest didn't slow. They surged forward, slamming into the makeshift barricades of biscuit boxes and mealie bags. Spears thrust through gaps. Shields smashed the walls. Men screamed as the Zulu tried to pull rifles from their hands. Bromhead moved along the front line shouting, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. "Steady! Keep firing!" Chard stood just behind the barricade, watching the enemy pour in from every direction. He knew this first wave wouldn't break them. The second might. The third almost certainly would. The defenders fired as fast as they could load, rifles jolting against their shoulders. Empty cartridges rained down at their feet. The muzzles glowed hot. Smoke burned their throats. But the Zulu didn't fall back. They climbed. Warriors leapt onto the walls, using their shields to deflect bayonet thrusts, trying to drop inside the compound. Some forced their way through the hospital windows, hacking at the wooden frames. Others probed every section of the barricade, searching for the weakness they all knew must exist. because no matter how fierce the British fire was, it couldn't hold forever. Ammunition was limited. Strength was limited. Fear wasn't. The Zulu pulled back briefly only to reform into a new wave. Their commanders shouted orders from the ridge, their deep voices booming over the crack of rifles. The Zulu impi moved with discipline, far more than the British expected, and pressed every angle of attack. The defenders shifted positions constantly, running from wall to wall as different corners of the station exploded into violence. The heat of the rifles, the sting of powder, the smell of blood drifting on the rising wind. Every second tightened the noose. The mission station, once quiet and sunlit, now felt like a furnace sealed shut. The hospital quickly became the breaking point. The Zulu realized it was the weakest structure, its walls thin, its windows low, its occupants half-crippled. They concentrated their attack there, smashing through the shutters, thrusting spears into the dark rooms, setting the thatched roof alight. Inside, wounded soldiers struggled out of their beds, firing pistols with shaking hands, swinging axes, using furniture as shields. The air grew thick with smoke, scorching their lungs. Flames flickered along the rafters. Patients crawled across the floor while others dragged them toward holes cut through interior walls, improvised escape routes carved with bayonet and boot. Corporal William Allen braced a mattress against a window, catching spear after spear until his strength failed. A patient pulled him away moments before a Zulu warrior burst through the opening. Private Hook, once known as a troublemaker, became a demon, hauling wounded men toward escape holes with one hand while firing a revolver with the other. The hospital turned into a maze of fire, screams, and shadowy figures fighting at arm's length. Smoke blinded them. Heat blistered their skin. Every room became a battlefield measured in inches. Outside, the defenders tried to cover the hospital windows, firing at any Zulu who approached, but the enemy numbers were overwhelming. Flames burst through the roof. The entire structure crackled. Chard saw the fire and made the call he dreaded. The hospital was lost. "Fall back to the inner wall, now!" Soldiers on the line fought their way backward, creating a new defensive perimeter around the storehouse. As they retreated, the Zulu tried to break through the shrinking space, using the confusion to push deeper into the compound. Bromhead led a countercharge, slamming into the advancing warriors with bayonets and rifle butts, driving them back just enough to re-establish the line. The Zulu pressure intensified. They came in waves, each crashing harder than the last. Their shields struck the barricades in a relentless rhythm, like drums beating against the British heartbeat. Rifle fire grew desperate, fast, less accurate. Ammunition runners, young boys, cooks, engineers, sprinted from man to man carrying boxes. Their faces were streaked with smoke and fear. They knew if they slowed, everyone would die. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others were hit mid-run by thrown spears. Still the line held. Night fell hard and fast, swallowing the battlefield in darkness. Only the flames from the burning hospital and the muzzle flashes illuminated the fighting. Dust turned the air thick and gritty. The smell of gunpowder hung like a storm cloud trapped in the compound. The defenders pushed their rifles through the mealie bags and fired almost blindly, relying on sound and instinct. The Zulu who got close enough thrust their spears through cracks, forcing British soldiers to dodge stabbing blades in the darkness. The entire fight became a shifting blur of sparks, screams, silhouettes, and shadows leaping over the walls. At one point, the Zulu managed to climb onto the roof of the storehouse. They leapt down from above, trying to break the line from behind. Bromhead rushed to meet them, cutting down one warrior with a bayonet thrust so close the man's breath hit his face. Private Hitch, wounded earlier, tied a rag around his arm and rejoined the fight, firing his rifle one-handed. Other men, bleeding and half-conscious, crawled to the line to support their comrades. No one had time to think. No one had time to pray. There was only the next shot, the next thrust, the next second of life bought through will alone. For hours, the cycle continued. Wave, recoil, wave, recoil. The British fell back again to an even tighter formation around the cattle kraal. Their world shrank with every step. The compound crackled with sparks. Smoke drifted in thick layers. Exhaustion clawed at the defenders, turning their arms heavy, their vision blurred, their movements slow. They fought on instinct now. Swivel, fire, thrust, reload, fire again. Fingers burned on rifle barrels. Ears rang from constant blasts. Men coughed up black powder. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat, blood, and dust. At the height of the night battle, the Zulu almost broke through. A massive push at the north wall forced the British to double up the line. Spears punched through sacks. Shields smashed down gaps. Warriors clambered onto the barricades, trying to rip them apart with their bare hands. The defenders screamed for ammunition. Boxes ran low. The line creaked like a ship under too much weight. If even a handful of Zulu made it past the Mealie bags, the defense would collapse in minutes. But somehow, no one could explain how, the line held, just barely, because every man on that wall fought like someone who knew there was no tomorrow if he failed. This wasn't about orders. This wasn't about the empire. This was about survival. Around midnight, the Zulu pulled back slightly, only to shift tactics. Warriors took up positions in the darkness and began firing stolen rifles at the defenders. The British crouched low, trying to return fire at shadows. Some Zulu used the long grass to crawl toward weak spots. Others hurled spears in arcs, letting gravity do the killing. One struck a lantern, plunging half the compound into darkness. The defenders blinked through the smoke, hearts pounding in their throats. Still the Zulu came, hour after hour, wave after wave. A rhythm of death that seemed endless. By 2 a.m., every man at Rorke's Drift was fighting on fumes. They'd been in constant combat for almost 8 hours. Many were wounded. Some were delirious. Several collapsed only to be dragged upright by their comrades. Still, they refused to step back. The Zulu now attacked from the south, then the north, then the east, probing, pressing, adjusting with terrifying discipline. Their war cries rose and fell like a thunderstorm. The defenders braced each time the shouting swelled. Rifles cracked, sparks kicked from bayonets. Spears clattered against barricades. Men grunted, cursed, screamed. The compound itself looked like the inside of a volcano. Burning hospital, glowing coals, drifting smoke, flashes of light. Shadows of warriors flickering across the walls like ghosts. By 3 a.m., it seemed impossible they could last another minute. The British line trembled. Some sections fought 3 men deep. Others were held by wounded soldiers leaning on their rifles. Bromhead moved like a machine, yelling, pushing, firing, pulling men back into position. Chard shouted orders through a throat raw from smoke. Sergeant Bourne held the men together with a voice like iron. No one dared fall back unless he ordered it. And then, slowly, gradually, the Zulu attacks weakened, not from defeat, not from fear, from exhaustion. The same brutal effort the defenders endured also drained the warriors. Their last pushes were strong, but not as coordinated. Their volleys of spears slowed. Their charges grew thinner, their chants quieter. By 4 a.m., the Zulu were pressing only lightly, testing the defenses instead of crashing against them. The defenders didn't cheer. They barely noticed. Most stood in numb silence, staring through smoke, waiting for the next wave. The sky began to gray. A faint line of light touched the horizon. Dawn. The defenders blinked at it like it was a hallucination. For a moment, no one moved. Men leaned on rifles, shaking, bleeding, spent. Dust clung to their faces, uniforms torn, hands blistered, eyes dull and hollow. The compound looked like a graveyard of broken crates, bodies, and scorched earth. And then, through the morning haze, they saw it. The Zulu army, thousands strong, standing silently on the ridge, watching. No more charges, no more waves. just stillness. The Zulu commanders assessed the walls, the wreckage, the stubborn line of red coats who still hadn't broken. They had the numbers to attack again. They had the discipline, but not the will to throw more warriors into a position that, impossibly, refused to die. Slowly, like a tide pulling back, the Zulu turned away. The siege of Rorke's Drift was over. The outnumbered were still standing. Dawn rose slowly over Rorke's Drift, not with warmth or comfort, but with a pale and uneasy glow that stretched across a battlefield that barely looked real. The British defenders stood among ruins, silent, trembling, smoke-stained figures staring out at a landscape covered in bodies, broken shields, and scorched earth. The air hung thick with the smell of burnt thatch, gunpowder, and blood. The once white walls of the mission station were blackened. The hospital was nothing more than a skeleton of charred beams. The cattle kraal was a mess of crushed baskets, splintered logs, and footprints pounded deep into the dirt. Everything the defenders had touched was torn, dented, scorched, or shattered. And yet, somehow, impossibly, they were alive. Not victorious, just alive. The men barely spoke. They had fought for 10 straight hours, from sunset to sunrise, with no rest, no relief, and no promise of survival. Many couldn't comprehend that the Zulu were really gone. Some raised rifles as shadows shifted in the smoke, expecting another charge. Some simply slumped against what remained of their barricades, staring at nothing, caught between shock and disbelief. Bromhead limped along the lines, checking on men who were too exhausted to stand. Chard moved in slow, dragging steps, like every muscle in his body weighed 100 pounds. Sergeant Bourne, still upright and somehow still composed, counted the survivors with a methodical calm that barely hid the shake in his hands. No one celebrated. No one felt triumphant. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like the moment after a scream. And then, like a ghost rising from the night, movement appeared on the ridge. The Zulu army stood once more, thousands of warriors lined along the horizon, their silhouettes cold and still against the morning light. The defenders froze. Every heartbeat tightened. Rifles lifted. A whisper ran through the ranks. "They're coming back!" But the Zulu didn't charge. They watched, motionless, studying the battered mission station, the shrunken British line, the broken walls, the soldiers leaning on rifles for support. The British looked like men at their absolute limit. They were. Yet the Zulu impi saw something else, something deeper, a position that refused to break, a line that held through the night, through fire, through darkness, through impossible odds. A group of men who fought not like an empire, but like cornered animals who refused to die on command. And so, after minutes that felt like hours, the Zulu turned. Quietly, calmly, with no panic, no retreat, no shame. They simply drifted back over the ridge and disappeared into the morning mist, returning to their regiments, their homesteads, their commanders, leaving behind a battlefield where neither side felt like winners. The defenders of Rorke's Drift watched them go, still unable to move. Many sank to their knees. Some sobbed openly. Others stared blankly at the sun as though seeing it for the first time. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival, pale and fragile, a candle flame protected through a hurricane. As the sun climbed higher, the men finally found the strength to move. They began collecting ammunition, what little remained, and reloading rifles in case the Zulu returned. They dragged bodies from the barricades, stacking them gently, covering them with torn blankets or spare cloth. They checked the wounded, applying makeshift bandages torn from shirts, steadying hands still trembling from shock. The hospital ruins still smoldered, glowing faintly with orange embers. Private Hook and the surviving patients staggered out of the wreckage, faces blackened with soot, eyes red from smoke. Chard couldn't believe they were alive. He walked the perimeter, inspecting the damage, replaying every moment of the night in his head. The ground was pocked with spear impacts. The mealie bags were slashed open, their contents spilling like pale rivers across the dirt. Blood soaked into the soil so deeply the earth itself looked bruised. This was not a battlefield. It was a scar. Around mid-morning, distant gunfire echoed from across the plain. The defenders tensed again. Then they saw it, a column of British soldiers marching toward the station, hundreds of them, under the command of Lord Chelmsford himself. Relief washed over the defenders like a tide breaking through a dam. Reinforcements at last. Safety at last. Chelmsford entered the compound slowly, looking around at the devastation. The faces of the defenders were hollow, gray, sunken. Their uniforms were shredded. Their hands were black with powder. Their eyes looked both dead and burning at the same time. Chard and Bromhead approached him, saluting with the last scraps of strength they had. Chelmsford surveyed the wreckage, then glanced toward the ridge where the Zulu had stood. He saw the shattered hospital, the stacked barricades, the scorched earth, the piles of bodies. And for a brief moment, a rare moment, he said nothing. Even he couldn't deny what had happened here. The survivors gave their report in halting sentences. They described the waves of attacks, the hospital inferno, the near breaks in the line, the endless volleys through the night. Chelmsford listened with a solemn expression, nodding occasionally, but the men could tell he hadn't expected this. No one had. Rorke's drift wasn't supposed to survive. It was supposed to fall just as Isandlwana had hours earlier. Yet here it stood, the most unlikely stronghold in the empire, held by sheer will and desperation. As Chelmsford's men walked through the ruins, they grew silent. They'd heard rumors on the march, but the reality was worse and more impressive than anything they imagined. They found bullet holes and spear strikes on every wall, barricades shredded, bodies piled in heaps, blood trails leading from one defensive line to the next. They found men who had fought on broken ankles, men who had been stabbed but never fell back, men who had passed out from exhaustion only to wake up and rejoin the line. They found 9 corpses inside the burned hospital, men who died pulling others to safety, their hands still clenched around burned rifles. The ground told the story. It didn't lie. It didn't exaggerate. It didn't soften anything. It spoke only truth. By noon, the full weight of what had happened began to settle. Word spread fast, first through Chelmsford's column, then through other units, then back across the border, through newspapers, across ports, across oceans. Reports framed it as courage, as discipline, as a symbol of imperial resilience. They called it a miracle, a last stand worthy of legend, a triumph against impossible odds. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded, more than any single engagement in British military history. Bromhead, Chard, Hook, Hitch, Sheese, and others became names passed in pubs and barracks around the world. Songs were written, paintings commissioned, newspapers published heroic illustrations of the tiny garrison holding a wall of flames against an endless sea of spears. The Empire, still reeling from the humiliation of Isandlwana, clung to Rorke's drift like a lifeline. A story that proved the Empire was still powerful, still destined to expand, still able to withstand storms. But the men who fought there didn't feel like heroes. They didn't feel victorious. They felt haunted. Many of them struggled in the weeks after the battle. Some couldn't sleep, hearing spears striking wood every time they closed their eyes. Some woke up gasping, dreaming the hospital was burning again. Some refused to talk about what happened. Some talked about it constantly, unable to let it go. War paints legends on the surface, but beneath the ink are men who saw too much, lost too much, survived too much. Rorke's drift became a symbol, a moment the world remembered, but the survivors carried the weight of it long after the songs faded, The Zulu, too, remembered the battle differently than the Empire did. To them, Rorke's drift was not a humiliation. It was a test of strength, a clash of courage, a demonstration of the discipline their regiments had earned under Shaka's system. They respected the defenders for holding, just as they respected the warriors who fell in the assault. They moved on with dignity, not defeat. They didn't need songs. They had memory. They had pride. They had the knowledge that even if they hadn't taken the mission station, they'd shattered a British column at Isandlwana earlier that same day. The war would continue. More blood would fall. More battles would scar the land. But the legacy of Rorke's drift, shared by both sides, would never fade. As the months passed, the ruins of the mission station were rebuilt. The hospital rose again from ashes. The walls were rebuilt with stronger materials. Graves were marked. But the earth beneath remained the same. It remembered the footsteps. It remembered the screams. It remembered the night when 150 stood against thousands and refused to bend. And long after the soldiers moved on, long after the war ended, long after the empire shifted and faded, long after the last survivor died in a quiet bed far from the battlefield, the story of Rorke's drift lived on. Not because of medals, not because of newspapers, not because of pride or propaganda, but because sometimes history stops being numbers on a page and becomes something else. The moment humans discover what they're capable of when there's nowhere left to run. Rorke's drift wasn't a battle won by strategy. It wasn't won by technology. It wasn't won by training. It was won by refusal. A refusal to collapse, to surrender, to die quietly. A refusal to be erased. So the legend endured. A tiny station in the middle of Zululand became a monument to the impossible, a stand where the few held the many, a night where walls of sacks became battlements, a firelit maze became a fortress, and ordinary men became something more, not because they chose to be heroes, but because fate gave them no other choice. That is why Rorke's drift stands in history, not as a victory, not as vengeance for Isandlwana, but as the simple, brutal truth of war. Sometimes the most powerful force on the battlefield is the will to hold one more minute, one more wall, one more breath. And Rorke's drift held until dawn.